I'm sure everyone's heard in the movies, failure is not an option. I'm going to try and convince you that, in actual fact, we should be trying to fail, and that's the way we can innovate and progress in space exploration. So a few years ago, we set up the goal to try and send a spacecraft to every body in the solar system, on orbit or on the surface of the thing, in less than 25 years. So to give you an idea of what biggest scale task that is, there are more than 1 million bodies in the solar system, planets, moons, asteroids, with a diameter of more than 500 meters. So, okay, that's quite ambitious. It's going to be somewhat tricky to try and pull off. To give you a bit more context, there have been, since the beginning of the space age, there have been about 70 successful Earth escape missions. And these have typically costed between a few tens of millions to a few billions of dollars per mission. Now, of course, if you multiply a few tens of millions to a few billions by 1 million spacecraft, you actually run out of all the money in the world, which is a little bit of a problem. So we thought maybe there's another approach to try and solve this. So the idea we came up with was the pocket spacecraft. So this is a spacecraft that's small enough, because in space, mass and cost are very much linked to each other. Small enough and cheap enough that anyone could afford to own and operate. Small enough and cheap enough so that they could fail. We could try experiments without having to worry too much about it. Because one of the problems is with these very expensive missions, because so much money has been spent on it, if it fails, everyone's in trouble to some degree. Despite that, more than 50% of those big missions do fail, despite the incredible engineering that goes on behind them. So, failure is not unknown in the space world. So what we came up with was the pocket spacecraft. So either a printed circuit board sized spacecraft like this or a thin film spacecraft like this. And the idea is that they're customizable. So we have mass customization, so people can try lots of different designs. They're open source, so once someone has a design that works, other people can use it. But equally, if you have designs that fail, people can learn from those failures and adapt and respond. We actually print these spacecraft, so we use printable electronics. So that way we can have 1,000 different spacecraft or 10,000 different spacecraft in a mission, and they can all be slightly different, because there's no point having 1,000 all the same failing simultaneously. And although at the moment we print them on Earth, one day we want to print them in space, so that we can actually reduce the time to do a mission and start exploring. So what might you do with these kinds of spacecraft? Well, for example, even on Earth, in the upper atmosphere, there are regions that are too high for weather balloons because they fail by bursting, and they're too low for traditional spacecraft because they're too massive and they burn up on re-entry. So a thin film-like device like this will fall all the way from orbit to the surface of the ground like a leaf falling from a tree. And it means you can take these measurements in these parts of the atmosphere you can't get to any other way. You can send these things to the moon, and in fact, next year, 200 of these will go to just below the International Space Station, and the year after that, about 2,000 of these will go on a lunar mission. So we can try ideas that people have talked about for a long time, swarm missions, distributed radio telescopes on the far side of the moon, where the moon is shielding the radio signals emitted by the Earth, so we can listen out for radio astronomy, and things like that. If you go further afield, somewhere like Mars, you can try dropping tens of thousands of sensors all around the planet. So although a rover can travel these days tens or possibly even hundreds of kilometers over its lifetime, you can get into the crevasses that your rover couldn't go, or go to the tops of the mountains you couldn't go any other way. Go to more hostile environments, places like Venus. A cozy 400-degree centigrade surface is not the most hospitable region for most spacecraft. But we don't care. These things are cheap. They're a few tens of dollars, a few tens of pounds, so we can risk it. If you go somewhere like Saturn's rings, this is icy rubble traveling at high speed around the planet. And those that make it, those that actually get into the rings and survive, they'll send back incredible data that we won't have any other way of doing. It's just too risky to send a billion-dollar mission there. But even those the attrition rate, those that fail as they go into the rings, we can learn information from the rate at which they fail. So it's not an all bad thing if these things die. It's not just in space. On ground, one of the things you have to do if you're doing a space mission is you need to have a big communications network to actually talk to spacecraft. The traditional way of doing this is that you have a few very large, very expensive antennas pointing at your spacecraft, and you try and get to 100% uptime. But we don't have the money to do that. So instead, our approach is we have thousands or tens of thousands of private individuals, each using simple antennas that, as long as they have a few seconds connection with the spacecraft, in aggregate, they become a very reliable system. And of course, there's the virtual world. If you're going to design space missions and make sure that they work, you want to simulate it in a virtual environment, and so we provide tools for that. So what I'd say is bring us your crazy ideas. Come and explore the solar system with us. Where do you want to explore today? Thank you very much.